Good evening, everyone. My name is Carolyn Barber Pierre. I'm the Assistant Vice President for Student Affairs in the Carolyn Barber Pierre Center for Intercultural Life. And I am delighted to be one of the co-hosts of this program tonight. On behalf of the Tulane administration, faculty, staff, and students, parents, alumni, community partners, I am delighted that we are here for this very important topic around race in America. I am delighted that we have an amazing award-winning author, Isabel Wilkerson, author of two amazing books. And I hope you're as excited as I am to hear this conversation. I am joined tonight with my co-host, Ms. Sienna Abdul-Ahad, who is my director of the Office of Multicultural Affairs at Tulane, and my partner in crime. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Sienna Abdul-Ahad.
Thank you, Carolyn. I have the pleasure tonight of introducing our speaker, Isabel Wilkerson, winner of the Pulitzer Prize and the National Humanities Medal, is the author of the critically acclaimed New York Times bestsellers, The Warmth of Other Suns and Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents. Wilkerson's work, in the words of the American Prospect magazine, is the missing puzzle piece of our country's history. The Warmth of Other Suns won the National Book Critics Circle Award, among other honors, and was named to more than 30 Best of the Year lists, including the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the New Yorker, and the Washington Post. Time magazine named it one of the 10 best nonfiction books of the decade. The New York Times magazine named Warmth to its list of best nonfiction books of all time. Her new book, Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, was published in August of 2020 to critical acclaim and became a #1 New York Times bestseller. Dwight Garner of the New York Times called it an instant American classic and almost certainly the keynote nonfiction book of the American century thus far. Oprah Winfrey chose it as her 2020 Summer-Fall Book Club selection, declaring it the most important book she had ever selected. Wilkerson won the Pulitzer Prize for her deeply humane narrative writing while serving as Chicago bureau chief of the New York Times in 1994, making her the first Black woman in the history of American journalism to win a Pulitzer Prize and the first African American to win for individual reporting. In 2016, President Barack Obama awarded Wilkerson the National Humanities Medal for championing the stories of an unsung history. As a historian, Jill Lepore observed in The New Yorker, what Wilkerson urges isn't argument at all, it's compassion. Hush and listen. Just a reminder that recording is not permitted for this event. Please join me in welcoming Isabel Wilkerson.
Hello, good evening. It is such an honor and a privilege to be joining you this evening. I so wish that we could be together in person. I love New Orleans, and I remember being at Tulane several years ago for the Warmth of the Sun, so it's such a joy to be back with you, and particularly to be joined by Mayor Landrieu, who showed such incredible, tremendous courage in leading the way as a son of the South in beginning to address the history that we've inherited. So thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you so much for engaging with this work. So here we are meeting virtually in the midst of the ravages of climate change. We've seen New York underwater, New Orleans struck by wind and hurricane, California on fire. We are in the midst of political upheaval and global pandemic that continues to threaten us as the virus mutates faster than we can keep up with it. worsened by and laying bare the deep divide that threatens our democracy. In recent times, it's not been uncommon to hear people say something along the lines of, "This is not my country," or "I don't recognize my country," or "This is not what America stands for." And whenever I hear that, I'm reminded that not enough of us know our country's true history. Because if we knew our country's true history, we would have a better understanding of the fact that our country is in some ways like a patient with a pre-existing condition, like heart disease. And if a patient has heart disease, and then that patient has a heart attack, you might be alarmed, you might be upset, you might be moved to action, but you would not be surprised if a patient who had heart disease had a heart attack, if a heart patient without intervention and treatment had a heart attack. And so much of what we need to know about our country would help us to understand what it is that we're seeing in our current era. The book that brought me to your attention is a book that I did not wish to write, but which demanded to be written. And shortly after it was released last year, in the summer of 2020, then I had to go out on to the virtual tour, only being able to see people essentially divided through a screen, the veil of a screen between us all. And as I went out, I remember one of the very early events, the facilitator, the moderator said to me, "We've been through so much as a country. We've been through, we're in the midst of a global pandemic. We have been through the upheavals and uprisings over what happened to George Floyd. We are in the midst of a fraught political campaign. And then in August, you dropped Caste on us." And I said to him, he said this very good naturedly, and I said back to him, "I didn't drop Caste on anyone. Actually, Caste is with us whether we recognize it or not. Caste is with us whether we choose to acknowledge it or not. Caste is with us whether we actually can see it or not. It is part of what leads to so much of the division. It's the infrastructure of the divisions that we have inherited." And so here we are also in the middle of the second year of this global pandemic. And this is with the latest mutation surging and others forming in the wings. And here we are having to come to terms with the consequences of hierarchy and caste. We as Americans are having to confront the fact that the United States, the richest nation and most technologically advanced nation in the world, leads the world in the grimmest of distinctions. And that is that it leads the world and has led the world throughout much of this global pandemic with the largest number of recorded cases of COVID-19 deaths. We have led the nation, we've led the world in the number of deaths throughout much of this pandemic, with close to 700,000 Americans losing their lives to COVID-19, by far more than any other nation, and particularly more than our peer nations. And then when it comes to COVID cases, the United States again leads the world with more than 40 million cases. That's millions more than the second highest ranked country, which would be India, which is fast gaining in this saddest of distinctions. The numbers for our country are in line not with our peer nations, but with the developing world. How is it that these two very different countries, the oldest democracy in the world and the largest democracy in the world, are being stricken with these numbers? One country has the world's oldest caste system, and the other has a less recognized one. A caste system, through its social controls and stigma and other pillars of caste, embeds and foments division. It programs people into believing that they have no stake in the well-being of those that they have been told are beneath them, those that they are told are unworthy, undeserving. It makes for a less magnanimous society, a built-in us versus them distance between groups. It affects policy. It affects how people vote. It affects where people choose to live, where they send their children to school, where they and their where the country invests, where people, who people will choose to hire, who they will grant a mortgage to. It affects every sphere of our society. There are many reasons why we find ourselves in the current crisis, but caste and the divisions that it sows surely is among them. Caste is not a word that is often applied to the United States, but Dr. Martin Luther King came to the realization of the enlightenment and of what can be learned when we think about ourselves from a different lens. He came to this realization in the winter of 1959 when he made a historic trip to India. He'd always wanted to visit India. He'd been so inspired by the nonviolent protest philosophy of Mohandas K. Gandhi, and he finally had the chance to visit in the winter of 1959. When he arrived, he was actually greeted as a visiting dignitary because it turned out that people in India had been paying close attention to the liberation efforts, the liberation movement of African Americans at that time. And so everywhere he went, people wanted his autograph. They recognized him instantly. They were keenly aware of the movement that he was leading. At one point in the trip, he wanted to visit with people who were then known as untouchables. These are people who were ranked so low in the Indian caste system that they were actually outside of the caste system, and he wanted very much to visit with them. These are people now currently known as Dalits, but he wanted to visit. So he made a trip to the southern part of the country, and he visited a school that was populated by students who were from families that were then known as untouchables. And when he arrived, the principal was so excited to introduce him to the students, and he gathered the students around and he said to them, "Young people, I wish to introduce you to a fellow untouchable from the United States of America." And when Dr. King heard that language applied to him, he first bristled at it. He was actually peeved to hear this language applied to him. He did not see himself in this way. He had not seen himself in this way. And he was really floored to hear this language applied to him. And then he thought about it. He thought about what was at that moment 20 million Black people in the United States whose efforts at being recognized as citizens, he was leading that effort. He was leading that movement. And these were people, 20 million Black people who were held in a fixed place, people who were consigned to essentially outside of the body politic. They were prohibited from being able to vote. They were prohibited from many, many lines of work. They were restricted as to where they could live, where they could go to school, again, the occupations that they could hold. They were being held in a fixed place, excluded from the economy and the body politic, and their efforts to be recognized as citizens were being met with tremendous hostility, resentment, and in fact, violence. And so he thought about it and he said to himself, I am an untouchable, and every Black person in the United States is an untouchable too. Dr. King came to the recognition, the realization of the idea, the concept of caste and how it could be applied to our country, because those who knew best what a caste system was, those who were at the very bottom of the caste system of India, instantly recognized caste when they saw it, and they connected their system of hierarchy to our own. Again, caste is not a word that's often applied to the United States. It's considered the language of India or feudal Europe, but there are anthropologists and scholars of race who literally risk their lives to go into the Jim Crow South and to document the hierarchy and the system of hierarchy in the American South, in the Jim Crow South, in the early decades of the 20th century, and they emerged from their work using the language of caste. Caste is essentially an artificial, arbitrary, graded ranking of human value in society. It's what determines one's standing. Determines one's standing, respect, benefit of the doubt, access to resources, or denial of access to resources, assumptions of competence and worthiness and intelligence, whether one will be protected by the authorities or attacked by the authorities. Caste is the infrastructure of our divisions. Any number of arbitrary metrics could be used to rank people in a caste system. Ethnicity, religion, language, place of origin, heritability, lineage, In our country, the metric that the early colonists used to divide and to rank people, to determine who would be slave or free, who would have rights or no rights, not even over their own bodies, who would profit from the labor of that was extracted from others, or who could be reduced to a commodity, who could own property or who could be property, who could be bought, who could be sold, won on a bet, given away as a wedding present, was the metric that we now consider to be race. This means that the colonists used otherwise neutral physical characteristics that should have had no meaning other than the range of human manifestation. And they used these neutral physical characteristics to assign people to an inherited role in a hierarchy before there was even a United States of America. Slavery thus became the foundation of a hierarchy built on greed and exploitation, was succeeded by Jim Crow, apartheid, and cast a shadow over the country to the current day. Those of us alive today are tasked with having to explain to succeeding generations, how is it that the things that we have witnessed could possibly have occurred in our era and in our country? Those of us alive today have to find a way to explain what happened in May of 2020 to George Floyd, for example. How is it that this man, something that should have happened, should happen to no human being anywhere on the planet, could happen, this could happen in our country in our day. To see George Floyd and what happened to him, to see his, we alive today literally saw a man killed before our very eyes, 9 minutes and 29 seconds. And in doing so, we saw a man whose humanity was stripped from him, whose life was drained from him, and over what? It was over the presumed accusation of his supposedly having attempted to pass a counterfeit $20 bill. For this, we saw his life drained from him, no one to help him, no one to save him. And we learned in the trial of his assailant that this was an infraction that did not even merit an arrest. It actually merited a citation and then a court date. But instead, for this accusation, he was killed and lost his life because of that. And those of us alive today are tasked with having to find a way to explain this to succeeding generations. And then earlier this year, January 6th, we saw a different iteration of Caste. There we saw a mob of insurrectionists who broke into the United States Capitol, broke into the citadel of democracy itself. We saw a mob ransack the belongings of lawmakers. We saw lawmakers forced to barricade themselves to protect themselves from the mob. We saw the people in this mob literally attack police officers. And we know that half a dozen police officers lost their lives as a result of that attack. But then we saw something else that is indicative of Caste too. We saw that later that day, those very people who had broken into the citadel of democracy, leading to deaths and injuries. We saw those same people walk down the steps of the Capitol with their lives, something that was denied George Floyd just months before over the presumed accusation of trying to pass a counterfeit $20 bill. Because not enough of us know our country's true history, far too many of us speak of slavery as a sad, dark chapter in our country's history, when in fact it was the foundation of the country's political, economic, and social order. Because not enough of us know our country's true history, not enough of us realize that slavery lasted for nearly a quarter of a millennium. It lasted for 246 years. It lasted for 12 generations. How many greats do we have to add to the word grandparent to begin to imagine how long slavery lasted on this soil? Another way of looking at it is to recognize that slavery lasted for so long that it will not be until next year, 2022, that the United States will have been a free and independent nation for as long as slavery lasted on this soil. That's how long it lasted. Another way of looking at it that is quite sobering is that no adult alive today will be alive at the point at which African Americans will have been free for as long as African Americans were enslaved. That will not happen until the year 2111. It will not be until the second decade of the 22nd century that African Americans will have been free for as long as they were enslaved. It will not be until that time that African Americans will experience parity between slavery and freedom. We have not addressed, much less reconciled, what we are facing as a nation. No one was held to account for those 246 years of enslavement. No one was held to account for the rupture of secession and civil war. Instead, there are monuments to these men. Because we have not addressed, much less reconciled, what we have experienced as a nation, we saw a Confederate flag inside the United States Capitol. Again, we alive today are tasked with having to explain to succeeding generations, how is it that a rioter in 2021 could deliver the Confederate flag farther than Robert E. Lee himself? What we are witnessing are the ongoing consequences of our racial caste system and its response to threats to its existence, or more specifically, those who see dominance as their birthright, desperate to protect it at all costs. We saw the pictures and the videos of the United States Capitol under siege. We saw the mobs, enraged and self-righteous rioters literally climbing the walls to disrupt democracy itself. Later that day, though, we saw a different video, a different scene that circulated after the Capitol had been cleared of the rampage. And in this scene, we saw a crew of janitors who were brought in to clean up after the Capitol had been cleared of the insurrectionists. The crew of janitors labored in their uniforms, bent over with mops and brooms and with masks over their faces. They were, to a person, all Black. There was a white police officer there who stood surveilling them, the only one barefaced and without a mask. I saw instantly the people assigned to the subordinated caste for 400 years, still consigned to their historic role of serving, cleaning up after those programmed to see themselves as dominant, superior, supreme. Had people who looked like the janitors in that crew, seen working late into the night, deigned to burst through police barricades, deigned to break into the United States Capitol, well, we know it would have come of that. It is inconceivable. It is unthinkable. They would not have lived to tell. This is the enduring nature of hierarchy, the entitlement of the dominant to take and to assert what it perceives to be theirs, and the restrictions and subordination of those who were born to the group that was assigned to the very bottom from before there was a United States of America. The scenes of siege in our country's, in our nation's capital may have looked like a different country, but it is ours. What we saw may have looked like a different century, but it is ours. This may have looked like a long ago battle over justice waged and presumably won back in another era, but it is ours still. This is the country's karmic moment of truth. Will it follow the path of darkness and division, of hate and hierarchy that have riven it for centuries? Or will it rise to what Dr. King called the heights of the majestic and live up to its creed, become and defend true democracy with liberty and justice for every single one of us? What we have seen has made it wrenchingly clear that Dr. King's mission has not been completed. It will be up to all of us, and particularly the prime beneficiaries of our country's 400-year-old social order, to make it so. Not only for our communities, our children, our country, but for the species and for the planet itself. Thank you so much for inviting me, and I so look forward to this conversation.
Thank you. Now I have the pleasure of introducing our moderator for this evening. Mitch Landrieu is an American politician, lawyer, author, speaker, nonprofit leader, and CNN political commentator. He served as the 61st mayor of New Orleans from 2010 to 2018. When he took office, the city was still recovering from Hurricane Katrina and in the midst of the BP oil spill. Under Landrieu's leadership, New Orleans is widely recognized as one of the nation's great comeback stories. In 2015, Landrieu was named Public Official of the Year by Governing, and in 2016 was voted America's top turnaround mayor in a political survey of mayors. He also served as the president of the United States Conference of Mayors. Landrieu gained national prominence for his powerful decision to take down 4 Confederate monuments in New Orleans, which also earned him the prestigious John F. Kennedy Profile in Courage Award. In his best-selling book, In the Shadow of Statues, A White Southerner Confronts History, Landrieu recounts his personal journey confronting the issue of race and institutional racism that still plagues America. In 2018, he launched E Pluribus Unum, an initiative in the South created to fulfill America's promise of justice and opportunity for all by breaking down the barriers that divide us by race and class. E Pluribus Unum is building a series of programs and initiatives to cultivate courageous leaders who are committed to realizing an inclusive vision for the New South, champion transformative policies to reverse the enduring harms of America's Jim Crow era past for those who continue to experience them today, and change narratives that perpetuate systemic and interpersonal racism in order to shift people's attitudes and behaviors. Prior to serving as mayor, Landrieu served 2 terms as lieutenant governor and 16 years in the state legislature. He and his wife, Cheryl, live in New Orleans, where they raised their 5 children. Please join me as I welcome our moderator, former Mayor Mitch Landrieu.
Sienna, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Carolyn, thank you so much for having me and the whole Tulane family and all the students. And of course, to the fantastic Miss Isabel Wilkerson, I am overwhelmed to be with you today. To the students who are listening, you are in the presence of a great mind. I've been blessed to be with many smart people in my life, but Isabel, really, you rank up there with the best of them, if not the best, and are a gift to this country. And so I want to thank you. Those remarks should illustrate to the students who are listening that you're talking to a person of great experience, a writer, a historian, but somebody that's got courage and insight and is willing to see things that other people walk by and don't see, and then to speak them in ways that people can hear. And so, Isabel, I'm thrilled to be with you tonight. And, you know, as I read Caste, it was really, it was awe-inspiring in so many ways. It made me think about things that I had never thought about before, unfortunately. But in really the last chapter, which I want to come back to later, but in the second page of that, you talk about Albert Einstein coming over to our country and meeting Paul Robeson, the great opera singer, and Marian Anderson, who would sing in the great opera houses, but were unable to sleep in the hotels after their performances. And I just, for those of you that don't know, tonight, right now, as we're speaking, for the first time in American history, an opera composed by a Black man is being performed at the Metropolitan Opera in New York City by a New Orleanian, nonetheless, Taryn Blanchard, who's a dear friend of mine. And it was inspired by the memoir of another great Louisiana talent from the Grambling area, Charles Blow, who writes for the New York Times. It's called Fire Shut Up in My Bones. And it is being performed as we speak. The curtain went up about 45 minutes ago on one of the world's biggest stages. And rarely do we come across works that rise to the level of a magnum opus, a masterpiece. Tonight, that's being performed in New York City, and another is being discussed right here. Caste, The Origins of Our Discontents, as the New York Times described, is an instant American classic. So Isabel, I'm really thrilled to be with you. And I am moved by the talk that you just gave, but I wanna, as you have called us to do, dig a little bit deeper into the word caste, and note that you focus on that in this book. You didn't write about race directly. You called it caste. You talked about systemic racism or quote unquote racism when it comes to our societal structure, but you explain these concepts as though they're separate, but that they are clearly intertwined with each other. And as I was reading the book, I actually have to tell you, I started struggling about which one of these is caste and which one of these is race, and are they separate or are they together? And I wanted you to help educate me a little bit more and take us a little bit deeper into why you wanted to talk about that. You went to India, you went to Germany, you talked about other countries, you talked about the United States actually being used as an example. This has blew my mind, for Germany to actually come up with the perceived authority to do what they did, pre-World War II. So can you talk about that a little bit and help take us to school on that?
Yeah. Well, the idea of caste allows us to see ourselves through a different dimension. It's language that is not as familiar to us, so that it forces us to have to think differently about what we think we know about how our country is structured. Caste focuses on structure because when you think about caste without the E, that allows us to kind of see how caste can play itself out in a society. For example, caste without an E, one way that it's applied is where you have an apparatus that is attached to, say, an arm or a leg to hold the fractured bones in place, caste. And caste without an E applied to what you were mentioning about opera or a play, where you have an entire cast on the stage and you have someone stage right, stage left, in the foreground or the background. And every person on that stage knows where their place is, or is supposed to know. They're told where their place is. Every person on that stage knows the lines that they have been assigned to speak. They know how they're supposed to move. They know who's supposed to do what in that production. And so that means that there's this these pre-existing instructions, you might say, pre-existing programming about who's supposed to be where in a society. If we think about that stage, there's if you really know the script very well, then you know your lines and you know other people's lines. And when someone steps out of line, then you know that as well. And so this is about the programming that have been passed down through the generations as to who belongs where in the society. Another thing that is really useful, I think in thinking about caste and our country, is the idea that we are somewhat isolated often in our country. We think about things based upon what we know. We know that the geography of our country means that we have protection from both sides, both oceans, and so we don't often have to think about ourselves in relation to how other societies are designed. And this is one way to remind ourselves that there is a universal structure of hierarchy that has been applied in other societies. And what is it that we could learn from those other societies? What is it that we can learn from the structure of other societies? And I specifically was looking at societies where race was not the metric. Specifically where race was not the metric. I often get asked, well, why didn't you include South Africa? There's several reasons why I didn't include South Africa. One is because race is the metric there too in their hierarchy. So, and many things have been written about South Africa. But also when it comes to how South Africa created its apartheid system, it turned out that they looked to the United States as well. Their apartheid system followed ours. So we predate even South Africa, and we all look upon that system and that structure and that hierarchy with a sense of alarm at how specific it was. But these are some ways to begin to see how what we can learn from other societies and how any metric could be used to divide people. And it just so happened that race is the metric that was used in the hierarchy.
Yeah. Well, you talk about that a lot. Let me touch on that just a bit, because one of the things that I was ashamed that I just had to learn in your book and I feel strongly like you do that our country's been unable to look truthfully at our own history. And I think it's a real problem. Echoes of James Baldwin saying, well, the reason I criticize my country is because I love her so much. She does have that pre-existing condition, but people won't learn, they won't look, they won't do it. But in Caste, you do use the history of other nations such as India and Germany. And even though you didn't use South Africa, one of the things that struck me that I just was completely ignorant of was how those other countries, particularly Germany, used our Jim Crow laws to somehow justify their treatment, and to justify the Holocaust, to illustrate what they thought was right and wrong. They used us as examples. And I don't think most Americans fully appreciate that. So I'm interested in what inspired you to spend so much time in other countries. And what do you say to those that are still unable to accept and to look at our nation's history?
Yeah, well, I actually, when it comes to Germany, I wasn't looking to really get into the Nazi history. I actually was looking to understand how they had atoned, how they had reconciled their history from World War II. So I was looking for, in a way, guidance, inspiration for how a country could overcome a fraught history. And so in the process of looking into that, you get pulled into the history of just that they have been trying to atone for. And I had no idea. It was stunning to discover that American eugenicists were in dialogue with German eugenicists in the years leading up to the Third Reich. That the Nazis actually sent people to the United States to study the Jim Crow laws, with a special interest in how the United States had managed to define race, because it's a social construct, it's not real. So they were looking for, how could we define, how could we identify and stratify and come up with some characterization, something that would be a solid definition of race. And that's one of the things that they looked at. The anti-miscegenation laws were a source of inspiration, because it was the anti-miscegenation laws that were often the laws that defined what race was. The one-drop rule would come up in the anti-miscegenation laws. So they were fascinated by, they were studying the United States, and they were studying it in part because the United States had had and does have such a such a wonderful reputation, such a strong reputation throughout the world. And they wanted to be able to create something like that, but with, be able to have a good reputation as they were doing that. Of course, they went farther than anyone could have ever imagined. They did not need to come to the United States to learn how to hate. What they were looking for were the ways to create a structure and to justify what they were planning to do. Find legal jurisprudence, and those laws ended up becoming the inspiration for the Nuremberg laws.
Yeah, I was stunned to read that, and chastened, to be honest with you, that I had not known that before. But you mentioned September 6th, and what the mob did on that day. I have your book. I marked it up. I'm really sorry, but I wrote all over it. I actually circled something and wrote best paragraph in the book. Not that all of them weren't great, but I want to read this, and I want you to speak to it. And this is about Germany and what they had done. It says, Germany bears witness to an uncomfortable truth that evil is not one person, but can easily be activated in more people than we would like to believe when the right conditions congeal. This is when you start getting nervous. It's easy to say, if we could just root out the despots before they take power, intercept their rise, if we could just wait until the bigots die away. It is much harder to look into the darkness, into the hearts of ordinary people with unquiet minds, needing someone to feel better than, whose cheers and votes allow despots anywhere in the world to rise to power in the first place. It's harder to focus on the danger of common will, the weakness of the human immune system, the ease with which the toxins can infect succeeding generations, because it means the enemy, the threat, is not one man, it is us, all of us, lurking in humanity itself. That's a pretty dark paragraph. I want to juxtapose that to the last to the last chapter in the book, which is one of the most uplifting things I have ever read, and ask you to examine both of those paragraphs in the same book, and ask you whether or not you're hopeful about where we might be able to go, and whether you think we will ever be willing to deal with our history and to challenge the despots who are in front of us.
Well, I have to say that, I took on this this book, which, as I've said many times, I did not wish to write, from the perspective of kind of a building inspector, someone who was coming in to look at all the systems of a building. I describe our country as being like a house, an old house, and you don't want to go in the basement after rain, but if you don't go in the basement, you are not going to be able to avoid what is lurking there. It will come back to haunt you, whether you choose to recognize it or not. And so as I was approaching it, I really wasn't looking to render a set of 10-point plan of how to resolve it, because this is a task. This is the challenge for all of us as a nation. This is a structure that's been in place for 400 years. This is a structure that will take everyone. This is a structure that's actually multiple structures when you think about the different systems within our society, the legal system, criminal justice system, the healthcare system, education system, all of the systems that demand inspection and really overhaul at every level. And so my approach to this was to present this kind of like an X-ray of our country, and in hopes that together, all of us, because it will take all of us, would be willing to look deeply at the challenges that we face and to come up with solutions. The solutions are not going to work if it's just one group saying that it should be this way and others are not on board. It requires the country to recognize what needs to happen. And so that's the approach that I took.
Right. Well, it was the right approach, but right now you see what's happened throughout history is what I call the major clapback, where people are basically saying, I don't even want you to teach our real history. Not only do I not want to know about it, I don't want you to even try to tell me about it. And so on this issue, and this will be the last question, I could talk to you all night, and I know that we have some students that want to ask questions, but on this notion of reconciliation, there hasn't yet even been an acknowledgement, much less an apology. And so I'm just kind of really, sitting here wondering how unfair it is to ask for reconciliation before there's even an acknowledgement, an apology, or really an open-hearted willingness to move to the next space, wondering what it's going to take for us in the country to get to that better place where both you and I know we can be. We haven't scratched the surface of what America is really supposed to be yet, and how we're going to get there.
Well, that's why I've mentioned a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I believe that what can people do if they've not actually gotten a chance to know the truth? I believe that we can't come to conclusions about what is possible until people have the chance to know. I mean, these are things that people do not learn in school. I mean, here we are. I just discovered this connection between Nazi Germany and the Jim Crow laws. I mean, I had no idea. I mean, with much of the work that I do, people will say, Warmth of the Suns and this, but people say time and time again, I had no idea. I hear that all the time. I had no idea this happened in our country. I had no idea it happened in people say in their lifetime, and I had no idea. Not having an idea has consequences, and it has consequences. Right. It affects how people vote, it affects where people invest, and it affects everything. And so what is possible? We don't know what's possible unless people have the chance to actually know.
Right. I struggle with that. When somebody says I had no idea, my first response is really kind of a smart aleck response, like, well, why the hell didn't you know? But okay, sometimes we have blind spots. Like my mother said, nobody ever taught me that. And now the next thing I want to say is, now that you know, what are you going to do now? Which is another interesting take. But look, I could talk to you all night. We could talk forever. We have students who have some questions. And so to honor them, I want to kind of go to some of their questions. And so here's an incredible note from our audience, and I want to share it with you because I think you'll appreciate it. It's a quote. "Thank you, Dr. Wilkerson, for your rich work that helped me understand for the first time my parents' experience as part of the great urban migration from Alabama to Michigan. So this is incredible. And here's the question. In this post-George Floyd era with widespread and intense attention to DEI, how do we begin to dismantle the internalized caste system within ourselves, families, and communities? Some others use the term internalized colonization. What can we do as BIPOC do, as well as white allies?
Yeah, that's a big question.
Yeah.
I believe in the idea that caste is the language that I use, because caste is the programming that we all receive, meaning there's a uniformity to the ways in which the hierarchy places people at the top, people at the bottom, and those in the middle. There is a uniformity, and we all know in our bones where people fit in that hierarchy. We learn from a very early, we don't even need to be told. Children know, from the earliest going. And so because this is something that is so deeply embedded, I don't view it as necessarily internalized casteism, or it's caste. It's literally what people have absorbed the messaging about who is valued in society, who's devalued in society, who is expected to be where in society. We all know this. This is all built into how we see ourselves. And so to me, I mean, that's a very, very big question. And my first response is to first recognize that this is the programming that we have. How do you fix it? How do you reprogram yourself if you don't even know that you have been programmed?
Right.
How do you unlearn the script unless you know that you have been given a script? The first job is to recognize it. You don't fix anything unless you recognize what it is. You can't diagnose something. You can't heal from something that has not been diagnosed. And that's the first step toward healing. It's the first step toward healing wherever one might be in the hierarchy. I think in some ways we all face the same challenge, although we're all affected differently by caste or by these inequities. Each of us faces the same challenge, that we all have been raised in a society, passed down through the generations, about who belongs where in society, how things are supposed to work in our society. And I think that we share a common challenge of getting past it. One of the reasons that I want to mention, why I looked at Germany, I want to mention it again, is because it is essential that we all get on the same page about how we got to where we are. If you go to Berlin, you see there's a massive, massive structure right in the middle of this major world city. It's several football fields large. It's massive. And what it is the monument to those who perished in the Holocaust.
Right.
But the interesting thing is that there's no signage. It's not necessary. There's no exhibits that walls of exhibition explanation. There's nothing there to do that because it's not necessary. Why? Because they're all on the same page. They learn the history from the time that they're able to begin to understand essential human relations. I mean, as children, they all learn this. And it's taught, throughout the one's time in school. And then they've converted the places of horror into places of learning. They've turned them into museums. And so they have made sure that everyone is on the same page. That doesn't mean they agree on everything. It doesn't mean that everything, they've just had an election that was very, very close. But it means that there's some basic things about the country and the history that they're on the same page. And that's the beginning step.
Correct.
That we're just in the beginning phases of that.
And we actually have done the exact opposite. That's what the lost cause is all about. It's actually a denial. It's a restatement.
Absolutely.
It's an aggressive unwillingness to look at our history and to really think about it. Unless and until we do, we're going to continue to have challenges. Absolutely. All right, here's a second question. While creating the wonderful works, Warmth of Other Suns and Caste, as well as the conversations you continue to have around them, what has surprised you? And then this is my addition. What's coming next?
I have to say that what surprised me is that it has been embraced so widely. I mean, we're talking about how we all need to get on the same page. We're talking about what will it take to get people to be aware. You mentioned, so true that there's not been an apology, there's not been a reconciliation, there's not been even an acceptance or acknowledgement. So we have a long way to go. And yet the fact that so many people have embraced this book, the book stayed on the bestseller list from the time it came out for over a year. And then it became #1 only 1 week and 1 week alone. And that was the week of the 2020 presidential election.
Right.
It was #1 at that moment. And it was never #1 before or after. It was just that 1 week. And that said to me that at this, a moment of existential crisis and a search for understanding, that people were turning to this book as a way of understanding our country's divisions and its history. And so I find that very encouraging. I was both surprised by it, but also encouraged and inspired by that.
Yeah. All right. Some questions. What are your favorite books, and what is some of your advice for aspiring historians and writers?
Oh gosh, that's such a tough question about your
Be
favorite
tough
book.
on them now. Be tough. Don't let them off the hook.
They're tough. I have to say that, I have just emerged from spending so much time on this topic, and I've been talking about it nonstop for a year. So I have to say that because I'm mired in the idea of caste and its history, I have to say that I am so inspired by the work of Allison Davis, the anthropologist who literally risked his life to go into Mississippi as a Black man studying Jim Crow. He had to act as in accord with the caste system, and so I'm inspired by that. The book that emerged from his work was Deep South.
He hid himself for a good bit of time.
They had to act according to the role that they were playing. I mean, they couldn't even meet. He couldn't meet with his white counterparts, his white colleagues in public because it was too dangerous, and they were being trailed by the police the entire time. So that's a book that is deeply, deeply inspiring to me. The story of Allison Davis and what they did. Everyone should know about him.
Right.
The ways that he risked his life to help us understand.
You introduced me to him, and the self-sacrifice that human being made was unbelievable.
Yeah.
I mean, he committed his entire life to it, right?
We did.
And we don't know much about him. I mean, he's not popularly known.
No, he's not. Very few people even know who he is. Yeah.
All right. So here's my final question for you tonight. I read you my favorite paragraph in the book because it talks about how human beings who otherwise would consider themselves to be good people will either lay down and allow somebody or actually partake, or because they omit their presence, allow terrible things to happen. That's a very dark statement about human capacity for evil, which we all have. We've seen it many, many times. But the last paragraph of your book is extraordinarily uplifting. And it made me think about, and you talked about this in The Warmth of Other Suns, the incredible cost of 4 million people being expelled and not being able to live their full lives, which is really about leaving to seek freedom. But you talk about a little bit, you allude to it, but you don't talk to it directly. And I want to ask you to just kind of plumb your imagination and to help us think about what America could look like and could be if we would just accept the invitation to do what would seem to be so right and so simple, is to get past caste, to get through race, to really believe that diversity is a strength, not a weakness. What kind of future is waiting for us if we can figure out a way to get that done?
Well, the part of it requires us to think about what is it that caste denies us. And what caste denies us is it really denies all of us the chance to be who we are inside, because we have these pre-existing notions about who we should be. And that means that there are men, for example, who are held in a fixed place. They might choose to do something very, very different from what society has imposed upon them. There are women who might be wishing to do particular things, but there are impositions of expectations on them. There are people who are the children of immigrants. This is a common refrain of people who are the children of immigrants. Let's say people who are of Asian descent, or in particular, thinking, who will say that there's a tremendous amount of pressure on them to follow a particular path because the family expects that they should do a particular thing, when actually what they might want to do is to go into comedy or to go into acting. And there are many, many cases where people have said that. There are restrictions and limits on everyone. And of course, one of the group that has experienced a tremendous amount of restriction and subjugation from the very beginning are African Americans. think about those cotton plantations and those tobacco fields and those rice plantations and those cotton fields. I mean, on those cotton plantations and rice plantations and tobacco fields and sugar plantations were opera singers and jazz musicians and playwrights and novelists and lawyers and all kinds of people, teachers, and there are people who could have been so much more. We as a society have lost uncountable brilliance and genius and contributions that can never ever be recovered. I mean, that is, there are millions upon millions of people who lived in this country and never ever had a chance to be
Right.
who they could have been. I would say the majority of people of African descent never had the chance to be who they could have been. And that's a loss, not just for them. I mean, obviously, those who went before us who never had the chance to be what they could have become, much less, of course, the violence that attended enslavement and Jim Crow. There was a tremendous restriction and loss to them. But it's also a loss to the country and to humanity, because what are we losing by
Right.
not being able to make the most of all of our talent?
Right.
And in a world without caste, it means that each of us would be able to be who we are inside. Our talents, our gifts, our joys, our contributions could be made to make this a better country, a better society, a better world, a better planet. The solutions to many of the problems that we face as a planet could be coming from people who are held in a fixed place, subordinated either in this country or other parts of the world, who we never get a chance to hear from, who never have had a chance to contribute fully to our society. That is what we've lost, but also what we could potentially gain if we could find a way to transcend these manufactured barriers that we've inherited.
I thank you for that brilliant statement. That comes from a person that's got a great heart and a great mind and a great vision of empathy. I was asked on the chat the page on the book that was my favorite paragraph was page 267. Not that, but like I said before, not that every paragraph wasn't fantastic, but that's the one that tells you that human beings can be drawn into doing terrible things even when they think they're good people. And then I think that's something that is sobering. And finally, Isabel, let me just make a final comment. It should make us weep at what we've lost in a country because we have been unable to come together. That is true. But it is likewise true that if we stop doing that thing and we start doing the good thing, how much we have to gain from each other. And essentially, my general take is your book is really about freedom.
Yeah.
And that's really what America is about. And so I thank you for calling us into this space and this purpose. I thank you for your insight and your courage and your fortitude and your willingness to speak, because not everybody does. Silence, as Dr. King says, is just, that's the thing. So, I want everybody to just do your part, whatever it is, whatever you feel like you can do, however big, however small, speak your truth, be who you're going to be. And so thank you so much for being with us tonight. Thank you for allowing me to spend some time with you. I look forward to working with you in the future. And Sienna and Carolyn, I'm going to turn it back over to you. Good night, everybody, and God bless you all. I think you might be on mute, Carolyn. Sienna?
I'm sorry.
There we go.
I was having difficulty. I am just so grateful for this opportunity to hear your thoughts, your words, and all the passion and all the work that went into this book. Isabel, you've inspired us to think about who we are and where we need to go as a nation. Mitch, I really thank you for your opportunity to ask the questions, but just for your work as well. I hope we continue to struggle with these questions and how we can find all of our humanity and how we can let every person marginalized from every walk of life be able to realize their dreams. And that's the only way we as a people can move forward. I want to take this opportunity to thank all of the people who came together to really make this thing happen. Besides our center, the Office of Multicultural Affairs, I would like to thank Newcomb Institute, the Tulane Black Student Union, the new student leadership programs, and the Office of Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. All those offices came together because we really were committed to expanding the conversation about how we look at race, how we look at equity and class, to make us a better people. So thank you so much for this opportunity. And I'm wishing everyone a safe and wonderful evening.
Thank you.